passion for the institution of Congress.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Bennett.
I know it is the pattern that the chairman and the ranking member give the opening statement, and we do not. Could I request, as a point of personal privilege, a few moments in an opening statement, because the White House has specifically identified me as being hypocritical on this issue by virtue of my position with respect to a Y2K czar. And I would like to make that clear. If it would not be appropriate, I'll wait until after the panel.
No, go right ahead. But since we're upholding the institution of Congress, I suppose that suggests we should uphold the institution of an individual member to defend himself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. In November of 1997, I requested that President Clinton appoint a Y2K czar. I was the chairman of the Y2K committee created by Senator Daschle and Senator Lott here in the Congress to deal with a problem that cut across departmental lines. It did not have a legitimate home in any one committee. It cut across the entire government. Senator Lott and Senator Daschle decided to create a special committee to deal with it. I was appointed its chair. Senator Dodd was appointed its vice chair. And we proceeded with our hearings and came to the conclusion that we, the government, needed a counterpart in the executive branch, someone that would cut across departmental lines, who had the authority of the president behind him or her to speak for the president in focusing on this issue. And in February of 1998, President Clinton appointed a Y2K czar, John Koskinen. The first thing, maybe not the first thing, but one of the first things John Koskinen did as the Y2K czar for the executive branch was to call me as the chairman of the committee in the Senate and set up a pattern of regular consultation. Every Wednesday afternoon, John Koskinen, the czar from the White House, called me as chairman of the Y2K committee in the Senate, and we compared notes. I told him what we were doing in the legislative branch. He told me what he was doing in the executive branch. He invited me to go to a variety of activities with which he was engaged in the executive branch. I invited him to come deal with those of us that were trying to solve the problem in the legislative branch. We worked hand in glove together. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that the title czar was not necessary, but it did give a sense of focus to what we were doing. And when it was all over and the Y2K problem turned out to be a non-problem, my vice chairman, Senator Dodd, said, you know, we're in a no-win position, because if there's no problem, they'll say, you raised concern about something that didn't have any difficulty, and if there is a problem, it will be, well, you didn't do anything about it. So either way, we're going to get criticized, and we were. After it was over, the New York Times wondered why we had spent all that money when, in fact, none of the computers failed. That is a very different situation than the situation described by Senator Collins and the letter which I signed. And I do not feel in any way it's hypocritical for me to have taken the role I did with respect to Y2K and now say there's something that needs investigating, because the kind of circumstance we created then was very different from the kind of circumstance that we see now. And I think the record should be very clear that I am not changing positions just for political purposes, as some members of the White House press office may have suggested. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to get that off my chest.
Thank you, Senator Bennett.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the panel. It's very well done and fascinating. Let me pick out a few comments that you made, however, to disagree with and see what your response is. The comment, Mr. Casey, it's difficult to force an agency to do what they do not want to do. Anybody who's dealt with OMB as a cabinet officer will disagree with that. And they are now both dead, so I can tell the incident. When I was serving in the executive branch and we were at the White House making a very strong pitch for something we very significantly wanted to do to Cappy Weinberger, who was the head of OMB. It was very rough sailing. Cappy was called out of the meeting to meet with the president. We sat there waiting. He came back, grinning like the Cheshire Cat, said, "I just ran into John Ehrlichman, and he told me no. So you can't do it." That's the Nixon administration position, period. You've gone to the highest possible authority. There's no point in our continuing the meeting. Well, this is an unconfirmed presidential assistant who made the firm decision. Now, you are correct in that he was able to do that because Richard Nixon allowed him to do that. But I saw a circumstance, I worked for John Volpe. I saw the circumstance where John Volpe offended John Ehrlichman, as a result of which John Volpe did not see the President of the United States for 2 years. So let's not kid ourselves that these unconfirmed folks only have the authority to advise. The reality is the White House is a court. The President is the king. The White House staffers are courtiers, and it is the century-long duty of every courtier to keep anybody else from access to the king. And the White House courtiers do a very good job of that, regardless of which party is in charge or which administration is doing it. And in President Nixon's case, he paid a very serious price for allowing his courtiers to keep people who would tell him the things he needed to hear away from him. But let's understand that that's the case. Now, one other quick comment, responding to my colleague and the comment that says, well, the Congress cannot tell the President who his principal advisor is going to be. Congress passed a law creating the Council of Economic Advisors. And yet there is an economic czar, Paul Volcker, at the current moment. And the question is, who has the President's ear on the economy? And then there's the other advisor, Larry Summers. And if you want to influence the President, if you're a member of the Congress, whom do you call? Do you call the Council of Economic Advisors? Do you call Larry Summers? Or do you call Paul Volcker? Reference has been made to Nancy Ann DeParle, whom I have enormous respect for. I think she's terrific. And I have had a lot of conversations with her about health care. But we do happen to have a cabinet officer of Health and Human Services with whom I have never had a conversation about health care. Not because I have any opposition to her, but because it's my perception that Nancy Ann DeParle is calling the shots rather than Secretary Sebelius. We have an energy secretary with whom I've had a number of conversations about energy, because that's an area now of my responsibility here in the Congress. But I think the person calling the shots here is Carol Browner. And this is the management issue that this whole thing raises. I said what I said about the Y2K because that was a circumstance that cut across department lines. There was no way you could raise that issue within existing White House or congressional staff. But in this circumstance, you've got a Council of Economic Advisors, but the President has a czar. You've got the Secretary of Health, and the President has a czar. You've got a Secretary of Energy, but the President has a czar. And somewhere in this circumstance, at OMB or surrounding OMB, there's a John Ehrlichman who's going to, sorry, probably from Chicago, there's a John Ehrlichman who's going to say, no, and that's going to end it. Now, can you respond to all?
Actually, Senator, if I can, respond. First, with respect to the question of how difficult it is to make an agency do what it doesn't want to do, obviously, the White House can and does make agencies do what they don't want to do, but it is a heavy lift, as they say. Not every issue can be elevated to the president. The agencies deal, obviously, with hundreds and hundreds of important issues. And yes, if you get to John Ehrlichman, then ultimately you can probably close down debate. But you can't do that on every issue because there's simply too many. With respect to the question of is the fact that John Ehrlichman was speaking for the president, to the extent the president wanted Ehrlichman to deliver the message, that is fine. But the cabinet officers who were responsible for that issue had absolutely every right to say, we want to hear that from the president.
Mr. Secretary, can you respond to that?
Well, I can appreciate people in the White House saying no, Senator, based on personal experience. Whether or not they would be considered as czars, I don't know. I do know it's very interesting. Just two incidents come to mind. I remember right after the anthrax, I got sworn in on October 8th. The first anthrax death had been reported. Then we had that series of letters and deaths, and just a horribly anxious time for this country post 9/11. And the White House, the executive branch wasn't speaking with one voice. I mean, there was a cacophony of well-intentioned people going forward, but it's for 3 or 4 days there we had CDC speaking, NIH speaking, everybody speaking. I must commend the President administration around H1N1 did a much better job of having a single point of focus. But my coordinating role as Assistant to the President for Homeland Security, I remember calling everybody together in the Roosevelt room and saying, you know, we've got to do a better job than this, and from now on we're going to coordinate the message, we're going to do it through the White House. So that worked very, 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 very effectively. But there were other occasions when, then as Secretary stepping in, there were probably some, I guess my concern was there were some organizational matters that I thought we had greater familiarity with, better understood than perhaps somebody in the White House in terms of the effectiveness of the proposal we had just on an organizational chart, and was told no. And so I guess the challenge you have is distinguishing those times when this individual, confident of the President, gives exclusively that advice, and then occasionally when whoever it is around the President has actually veto power or veto authority can actually influence what that Cabinet Secretary wants to do. So that's the gray area that I think the executive and legislative branches have dealt with for 200+ years, and you continue to deal with it. So I've had experiences in both directions.
Thanks, Senator Bennett.